Welcome to the Data Room, where we share best practices and actionable tips on being a data-driven company, or as we call it, data first. If you're a B2B revenue leader looking to scale your growth stage business, come and join experienced CEO and tech founder Scott Stouffer in the Data Room. Welcome to our first episode of the Data Room. I am Heather Kitos here with Scale Matters CEO and co-founder Scott Stouffer. So we're talking today about the basics of data integrity. So Scott, tell me, what are the 2 most common problems that companies face regarding their CRM data, and why are they problems today?
Sure. Top couple problems regarding CRM data. I'd say first is they either don't have a data model, or to the extent that they have a data model, it's siloed along sort of organizational functional boundaries like sales model and marketing model, et cetera. And maybe might help to say what is a data model to start with. And we think that of a data model as basically what are the set of things that need to be measured in order to inform senior leadership teams so they can make really good decisions, so they can manage their customer acquisition process, if you will, or customer acquisition engine with a level of precision that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And so you need to have this data schema or data model to support this decision making. The reason that so many companies don't have it is because most companies are, I'll say, tool first and data second. So if you think about it, most companies, the way they evolve from startup into kind of early stage growth, as various people in the customer acquisition engine, whether it's salespeople or marketing folks or SDRs, are coming into play to do their job. They buy tools that help them to automate certain parts of the function. So, for example, why does a CRM even get put in place? Typically, it's because the first salesperson in a company is just finding it too hard to keep track of all of the prospects they're working. So it's really a prospect and opportunity tracking tool. Why does the first marketing automation platform get put in? Well, typically because the marketing person wants to send out a series of email campaigns, and it's a lot easier to sort of pre-populate those and schedule those using one of these automation platforms than do that all manually. So what happens is these companies end up with a series of technology tools that may or may not be sort of cobbled together, but it's only after the fact that they've bought the tools to automate that they start recognizing there's actually data available in those tools. So the data is almost an afterthought typically in most companies in terms of the way they evolve, which is why they don't have a data model. The other reason, is this whole notion of siloed data models. So let's say they do think about what data do we need to inform ourselves. Since most companies think of the functions, the organizational functions like sales or marketing or business development in their own boundaries, they allow each function to sort of develop their own way of trying to measure things rather than trying to, forcing a holistic view of the end-to-end process or end-to-end goal of acquiring customers or MRR. So the data models just tend to be disjointed. So that's a long-winded answer to say first problem is most companies just don't have good data models. The second problem is there's poor data integrity or hygiene, and that happens for a whole bunch of reasons. One, most of these companies, and we're really focused around growth stage companies in our conversations that we talk about. So maybe, single digit annual recurring revenue, like $5 to $10 million, all the way up to a couple $100 million. Most of these companies end up over time with these overly complicated manifestations of their CRM and maybe overly customized fields and objects that they're using. So there's rarely any one person in the company that actually understands completely how this stuff is set up. And as a result, people use the wrong fields for things. And so data gets populated in a way that wasn't intended. So that's certainly one cause of data integrity issues. Another one is the change, right? New people come in, new VP of marketing comes in, new VP of sales, and typically in most of these growth stage companies, every year and a half, at least one of them's being changed out. And they come in and say, okay, well, we're going to start doing this with the Marketo or with Salesforce or whatever. And there doesn't tend to be this notion of, let's first understand what's there. And then if we want to make changes, let's understand the impact of those changes. So one of the things we see often happen is people come in and add new stuff or change new stuff, and it actually renders the historical data obsolete. Because they don't think about, well, I have to map these old fields into the new way I want to look at things. And so because of the change in personnel and that happens, and the likelihood that new people, particularly in leadership positions, may want to put their own stamp on how things are working, you end up with a lot of disconnects in the data integrity. And that actually goes to another whole point of just change control, which is there generally isn't any. When we talk about production software, like what our company makes or other companies make, they have these data schemas and data models. You can't touch those, because if you do, the product no longer works, right? And so anytime the development groups have a new thought of maybe a change that would improve things, there's this review process for everybody to think through, okay, if we do this, how is it going to impact stuff? That rarely happens at these growth stage tech companies. So it's sort of wild, wild west. And with everyone having their fingers in the pot, you can imagine how easy it is for just the data to get messed up. A couple other things that come into play with data hygiene or integrity issues are we often rely, in the sales and marketing world, a lot of this data is created by the way the people on the sales team or potentially an outbound prospecting team interact with the tools. And so we often don't have the level of rigor within an organization to force a specific way for people to use these tools. So with everyone touching them differently, it makes the data very inconsistent in terms of what it might be telling you. The other thing is, along with that same point in terms of the involvement of humans, we often also overly rely on salespeople to put a lot of information into the CRM. So, for example, we all want to know who we're competing against, right? And what customers are saying about that. Yeah, we all want to know kind of what's the profile of these prospects? What are they saying is important to them and that sort of thing. And, historically to do that, we bang on the sales team and say, you've got to capture all this information. You got to take good notes, right? Well, if you're focused on taking good notes, you're not generally super engaged in the conversation itself. So it's hard. It's hard to be great at engaging and orchestrating a sales conversation at the same time as capturing good notes and making sure you go back later and stick it into the CRM. So this excessive burden we've put on sales team to populate all of this data that would be useful to understand just isn't realistic. And so, some companies put in these forcing mechanisms so that a salesperson can't move their opportunity to the next stage without filling out certain data. But anytime you do that, they just start putting garbage in. So, I think this whole issue of depending on salespeople to populate a lot of stuff is probably not a realistic goal either. And it certainly comes into play with why the hygiene and integrity issues are so pervasive.
That's a really interesting, all of those points are really interesting. If you think about a growth stage company, to your point, you're moving so fast, correct? Right? So all of these things are coming into play with different teams and you're hiring like crazy. And to take a step back and think about how you should put your data together and who's using this data and how are we architecting everything so all these teams can work seamlessly, sometimes it seems like that falls to the wayside. So
For sure.
you make a good point there. So let's say, you are kind of a revenue leader coming into a growth stage company, right? You're trying to raise that Series A, Series B. Where do you start with all this? Because you have kind of a mess that you're trying to figure, how to clean it up.
Great question. I think the first place you start is you start by treating customer acquisition or new revenue acquisition holistically. Yes, you may have your teams organized in functional boundaries like sales, marketing, et cetera. But you have to remember that those teams together serve one purpose, and that's to drive more revenue. So if you start, emphasizing the holistic nature of revenue acquisition, that's a good starting point. And with that in mind, a lot of this data and sales and marketing technology stuff that we were talking about is largely falls under the domain today of what's called RevOps, right? Revenue operations. Sure. And yet we see many, many companies have sales ops people in the sales team, marketing ops people in the marketing team. So the whole idea of having your operations people, who should be the point where all this stuff comes together, because it's the technology stack on a whole and it's the data set on a whole, to keep those people siloed is a huge mistake. And so the very first thing I'd do is I would recommend that companies start talking about customer acquisition instead of sales and marketing. And then as soon as they have any kind of investment in a RevOps team, that be a central team that crosses the traditional functional boundaries that exist in most organizations. So that'd be number one. Number two, and this is probably a little bit counterintuitive, but the first hire that most companies make in this general area is a Salesforce administrator or CRM administrator, and that's because initially when they first buy these various tools, the person who bought them is usually putting them in play, right? The head of marketing or head of sales, and then they realize over time, this is silly that I'm trying to do all this stuff. Let me get an administrator to do this. The problem is the administrators that get hired by these, what I'll call maybe Series A stage companies that are $5 to $15 million in annual revenue, they're relatively junior people. And their skills are at adding users, deleting users, building a report, building a dashboard in Salesforce. But they aren't necessarily data people. And so, we've seen a couple of instances where the very first hire was actually a business analyst who wasn't necessarily a technology guru, but the business analyst serves as this translation point, if you will, between the business needs of the executive team. The business analyst can translate that into data, into what data is required. So remember, we said you got to have a data model, right? Well, it's not a Salesforce admin that thinks about that or that builds a data model. It's a business analyst that does that. And so one of the things we think companies would be much better at is if they were quicker to bring a business analyst on to their sales and to their revenue team, who effectively own the responsibility of building a data model to support the decision making that needed to be made. And then the last thing I'd say is just I call it cultural sanctity of the data. And it's just amazing. I mean, well over 90% of the companies that we speak with, and they're all growth stage tech companies, express frustration with their data quality. So everyone's feeling the pain, but few companies have been willing to step up and say, no, we're not going to do it anymore like this, right? And we made an example, talked about an example earlier where, just locking down the data so that not everyone can come in and add new fields or change pick list values or anything else, and having review processes before you make any tangible change to the configuration of the CRM would go a long way. So I think, there's some tangible things like singular RevOps that crosses functional boundaries, prioritize the hire of a business analyst because that's really going to be the data guru for the senior leadership team. But then you have to culturally talk about the importance of having this data be right.
That totally makes sense. The permeance of data and its importance should be whether you are, a marketing specialist or the director of sales or the business analyst or the VP of RevOps. I mean, it totally makes sense if you're all not pointed toward that North Star, I'll say, of data integrity. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to maintain all of that.
For sure.
To the line. Cool. Well, I love the conversation there. We'll continue to keep this going in the data room. If you are experiencing any of these kind of data integrity problems that Scott talked about, I actually encourage you to check out scalematters.com/assessment. We're offering a complimentary RevOps data maturity assessment for listeners of this podcast. So that's scalematters.com/assessment. Check that out. Until next time, I'm Heather, that's Scott, and thanks for joining us in the data room.
Thanks.